Hey, welcome back to True-Moto-Resto. Today what I'm going to do is just go over a few tips on preparing your motorcycle for winter storage. The first thing is make sure the bike's been cleaned. Even with a generally clean bike, it's still going to take me 2 hours to clean this motorcycle to a degree that I'm happy with before I put it away. I mean, everybody's washed and cleaned their motorcycle before. I just think at this time of year, it becomes a little bit more important to get all of the crap off, all the dirt, any grime and whatnot, because then you can also see if anything is leaking or things might be broken or might need to be serviced. And as you're going over every square inch of the bike cleaning it, that's when you're typically going to find stuff as well. So you got to get in there in all the nooks and crannies. Like I've got a bit of a gravel road near my house, which I have to traverse about 1 kilometer of, and so you want to get all of that kind of stuff out of there, way in there. So what I do for that, you want to get in there with a vacuum cleaner. So typically what I do is I use a small shop vac, and then I've got a piece of clear hose line that's very small in diameter, and I kind of attach that to the end, and it allows me to get into all the nooks and crannies and vacuum bits of sand and gravel and whatnot out of here. So yeah, and then once you've washed it, put a layer of protection on there, like a wax or a polish or some other product that everybody's got their own favorites, right? Vinyl cleaner. So again, you can see here, it's over the course of the riding season, the white on the seat here kind of starts to get a little bit dirty. So it won't be this color when it's done, but you know, when you clean it off, it'll actually it'll brighten up a little bit. So I like to clean the vinyl on there as well. All right, just some of the cleaning products I like to use. This is not sponsored or anything like that. These are just the products I like. So SC1, it's a nice high gloss cleaner just for kind of getting into those hard to reach areas. Also Mocho Shine and Go. This is a pretty good product for cleaning up and keeping the paintwork nice and shiny. Similar stuff with the wash and wax. This is also quite effective on all the paintwork. The insect remover. Again, there's a bunch of products out there. I find this one works pretty well for getting all the crap off the front of the bike. Moto wash. So in cases like this where the bike's inside and conditions outside are just not conducive to me bringing the hose out, or the bike isn't that dirty but I still want to clean it, this stuff works pretty well. I also will use just a little bit of dish soap in a spray bottle with water and a little bit of alcohol. That kind of does the same sort of thing. For the vinyl, I get this at my GM dealer. It's about the most effective stuff I've ever found at cleaning up vinyl really nicely, or even it also cleans leather really well. iPhone chain cleaner. This is the one that has a fold-out nozzle, so it's pretty effective. And then Mocho chain lube. So I think this has like an alcohol-based carrier in it. So once you spray it on and it soaks in, the alcohol evaporates and it just leaves the wax behind. I find it's not quite as messy as some of the other chain waxes or chain lubes. So, and for working on and cleaning up the bluing or the yellowing on the header pipes and that kind of stuff, I use this stuff. Autosol Blue Remover. All right, so there you can see the difference that it makes with the blue off cleaner. I've just done this header pipe here. All right, so the bike is pretty clean. Still not finished. But I'm not going to film the rest of it just because nobody needs to watch me cleaning spokes for an hour. But the bulk of it is done. I'll still go over this probably for another, I don't know, 30 minutes or so, just kind of getting into nooks and crannies and whatnot. But generally speaking, it's reasonably tidy. So the second thing you want to make sure is that you've got a full tank of fuel. So if you're storing your bike for, let's say, 6 months, which is about what I end up storing my bike for on my riding bikes here in Canada. And so you want to make sure that you've got a full tank of gas and preferably high octane fuel and with no ethanol for the winter storage. And if you haven't got that luxury of a no ethanol fuel, which where I am, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So what I'll do is I'll make sure that I've used a fuel stabilizer with the appropriate amount in the fuel for the winter. For any of the bikes that are going to be stored much longer than 6 months, I drain the fuel tanks completely and I put ethanol-free fuel in them. I don't typically like to drain the tanks completely unless I know I'm not even going to run the bike at all for a long time. So typically, yeah, I try to fill the tanks and right to the very top. The whole idea being is I don't want any airspace in the tank for condensation to form. So as you get temperature changes and fluctuations, that's when the condensation will form inside the tank. And then it becomes mixed in with the gasoline, and eventually it will settle out at the most bottom part of the tank, and then that's when the tanks will start to rust over time. All right, so you can see there, if I can wiggle that, that's how full I've got it, right up to the filler neck. So maintaining your chain is also something important at any time of year. Obviously, you're lubricating your chain on a regular basis when you're riding, but at this time of year, it's especially important to make sure that your chain and your sprockets and everything are cleaned properly and thoroughly, and then re-lubricated before you put it away for storage. And at the same time, the other thing you want to do is it's a good opportunity to kind of double check your chain tension. The manual, I go through my manual and just make sure that I've checked the chain tension and adjusted that as I need to. That way when I get it out in the spring, I know it's basically ready to go. I guess probably the most obvious thing for the winter storage, at least to me, is the oil and filter change. I know some folks will do their oil and filter changes in the spring. I'm not a fan of that approach. I like to make sure that the bikes have their oil change done before they get put away for the winter time. That way I've not got old oil sitting in the sump in and around all the engine parts that's carrying contaminants, and they're just sitting there. And I always make sure I consult my manual for the oil change because each bike has its idiosyncrasies about the quantity of oil that is required, viscosity of oil is required, how many oil filters, how many drain plugs there are. This bike, for instance, it's a it's a DCT, so it's got a dual clutch transmission. It doesn't have a manual shifter. So there are in fact 2 oil filters. One which is your conventional oil filter, which is kind of down in there. I'll show you that later. And then there is a DCT transmission oil filter, which it's filtering the same oil, but it's just a smaller filter in behind here that has to be replaced. And then on this bike there are 2 sump drain plugs, one further forward, one at the back. So you got to make sure you pull both of those and drain the oil, because you don't want to have a scenario where you've only drained the oil from one of those sumps and then you put in the factory recommended quantity of oil and all of a sudden you've overfilled it. So yeah, make sure you're familiar with that. If you haven't got the manual, get one off the internet or buy one from the dealer. Okay, so here's the other thing I usually try to do as much as I can. I will buy genuine Honda oil filters. That way I know I'm getting quality. This is the genuine Honda DCT oil filter. It fits in there. I also make sure that I buy 2 drain plug gaskets, the cross washers that go on the drain plugs, because it's got 2 drain plugs. So I always replace those, never ever reuse them. And I also buy and replace the rubber O-rings, which seat in behind here to make sure that this is sealed off. So before you start the oil change, it's also important to make sure that you've got the bike up to a reasonable temperature. I like to run the bike for about 5 or 10 minutes, so the oil is hot enough that it'll flow a little bit better for draining, but not so hot that it's going to burn you when you pull the drain plugs and that kind of thing. I like to use rubber gloves as well. It just gives a little bit of protection against the oil, and if it is a bit warm, you tend to get saved from a burn a little bit if you're using rubber gloves. But it's just good to keep that kind of crap off your hands. So I like to make sure that every oil change I do, I start with a spotlessly clean oil drain pan. I can make sure that whatever's in that oil, if I find anything in the oil, then I know which bike it came out of, and I know if I have a problem or not. The filling procedure is different from bike to bike. So on the Africa Twin, I can put all the required amount of oil in one shot. On this bike, I cannot. I've got to put 3,000 milliliters or 3 liters of oil in first, start the bike up, and then shut it off, and then I can put the rest of the required amount of oil into it. Just follow. You're going to make sure you read the manual and follow the instructions. They're there for a reason, and checking oil levels is also peculiar to each bike. Sometimes you have to just check the sight glass window on some engines. The older style sight glasses are still out there, I think even on some of the newer bikes, and that's fairly easy to check oil levels. Other bikes like this M109R, it's quite a ritual. I can't remember the exact, I have to look it up every time I do it, but it's like you got to idle the bike for 15 minutes, and then while the bike is in the vertical position, you shut the bike off and you let it sit for 3 minutes. And then you put the bike on the side stand for another period of time, and then you can pull the dipstick, and then you can check it, and blah, blah, blah. So it's quite a routine. And if you don't do it exactly, and I mean exactly according to the manufacturer's instructions, you will not get the right reading on the bike. Some bikes, when they've got a dipstick, like this bike does as well, the manual tells you whether or not you need to screw it in all the way and then unscrew it to check the oil, or whether you unscrew it, wipe it off, and then you just dip it into but don't screw it in. So those are all things that it's important to understand to get an accurate oil level reading, and you don't end up with either too little oil or too much oil and that kind of thing. There is a spring behind here. There it is. There we go. When you put this cover back on, you got to be very careful to apply very even pressure, and you don't want to pinch that O-ring. Personal preference here with these smaller screws in the aluminum housings. I like to just do it by hand feel, not to do it with a torque wrench. So with the drain plug and the crush washer, you want to make sure what I do, I believe this is the right way, is you want to make sure the flat side of that crush washer is facing the bottom of the pan, and the rounded side of that crush washer is facing down against the head of the bolt. Again, I'm just cleaning the face of where the oil filter mounts here before I put the new filter on. Just a smear of engine oil. Just AMSOIL 10W30 synthetic is going in. This bike, because it's a DCT, takes, according to my manual, 4.2 liters. Each one of these is just under 950 milliliters, 946. So basically I'm going to put in four full ones of these, and then a little over 400 milliliters out of this one that I already have open. So. All right, a couple other tips. If you're gonna leave the bike in a shed, or if you haven't got a building to put it in at all and you're gonna leave it outside, I would recommend plugging up the exhaust pipes. Putting it in a shed or whatnot, putting something like a steel wool in here that's got some oil on it so it doesn't go rusty, keeps the mice from getting in here, causing all kinds of havoc and putting seeds and nests and all kinds of stuff into your exhaust system, and the bike's never gonna run properly with that going on. Similarly with your air intake, if you've got take the seat off, and if you can plug up the air intake easily, it just stops mice getting in. Up here in the storage in the shop here, I don't have that issue, but it's a good idea that if you're putting a bike in a shed or a place where mice can get in, then it's just a good safety mechanism that you're not going to have issues in the spring where your exhaust pipe's full of seeds and acorns, or your air box, or they've gotten into the engine or into the throttle bodies or whatnot. Okay, battery service and battery tending is another important thing that you need to make sure you consider. So all my bikes I put on a battery tender. So I've got these pigtails that are attached to the battery, and then I can just plug them in. I use either Optimate 3 battery tenders or Deltran battery tenders. All the bikes that I have these pigtails on the battery. Just makes it very convenient just to plug them in, and you're not taking batteries in and out. and dealing with all that kind of nonsense all the time. It's just much more convenient. Some bikes are very inconvenient to get at the batteries anyway. Like this Africa Twin is a nightmare. You got to take the crash bars off, you've got to take the toolbox off, and then the battery is kind of buried in there sideways. So the other thing to consider on a bike like this one, and this is kind of very specific to this bike, or to, I'll say, to a DCT bike, a dual clutch transmission. So this bike doesn't have a manual foot shifter. It's dual clutch transmission, basically automatic. And these bikes are very sensitive to battery voltage. So keeping the battery tended and keeping the battery healthy is important, because if the battery dies on you, you can't bump start them. So you need to have a reliable battery to start it. And also, if the battery starts to fail and deteriorate, the voltage starts to drop and whatnot, they do tend to exhibit some strange electrical symptoms and gremlins that can manifest in a variety of different ways. So with this bike being a DCT, I will cycle that battery out and change it just as a matter of course every 3 years, even if it's not misbehaving. I just don't need to go through the aggravation. So any other bike that's not a DCT, I'll be quite comfortable in predicting to get 6 years out of a quality sealed battery if it's been left on a tender all the time. But on the DCT bike, I'm just not going to take that chance. The other thing I'll do for some of my bikes is, if they have a center stand, I'll store them on the center stand, keep the as much of the wheels off the ground as I can. It's just, again, it helps preserve the tires a little bit. Also, consider whether or not you have the opportunity to use a heated storage facility. I'm fortunate here that I have, this is a wall-mounted propane furnace. All winter long, this is a minimum of 48 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 9 degrees Celsius. And then when I come up here to work, I'll just turn that on, and it'll go up to about, I can boost it up to 65, which is plenty warm enough to work in. But temperature-wise here, we're typically, minus 20 and minus 30 degrees Celsius is not unusual in the wintertime. And the colder it is, then the harder that tends to be on rubber parts, and it's not unusual to see hoses and O-rings leaking coolant, and sometimes tires could even lose air, the colder that it gets. So if you have the opportunity to put it in a heated facility, then that's a good thing to do. Not a lot of folks have that luxury, but keeping it inside, at least keep it inside if you can. Put it in the garage or in a shed or whatnot. And then of course, if you don't have that storage facility available to you, get a cover for the bike. That way, at least you're going to keep the majority of the rain and the snow or whatever off it, if you have to put it away for the winter. So the last thing I'll mention is tires and brakes. So typically, I'm checking my tires with some regularity through the course of the riding season anyway, just to make sure there's no cuts or nothing bad going on with the tires. But again, since I'm going over the whole bike and doing a service, I'm going to go over both the front and the rear tire and just make sure they're in good shape. Typically, I'm getting 2 riding seasons out of a set of tires on this particular bike. And because I'm a fair weather rider, I do not ride in the rain. My brakes will typically get taken apart and serviced when I pull the front and rear wheel to put new tires on it every other year. Aside from that, I'll just take a look and make sure that I haven't got any undue or premature pad wear, which I can see fairly easily on most of the bikes without taking the calipers off. If I was riding the bike in all kinds of weather, I'd be taking these calipers off at the end of the season and giving them a complete cleaning, and cleaning the pistons and checking everything out and lubricating everything the way it should be lubed. Every couple of years I'll change and flush the brake fluid on both the front and the rear master cylinders and reservoirs, just as part of the regular maintenance. This bike isn't due for that this year. And what it will be due for next year though is a coolant change. So again, back to, read the manual, follow the service intervals. So this bike will get a full coolant change, coolant flush and change at some point next year. But for this year, it'll be good to go. Also important to understand each bike. Again, there are things that each bike has that you need to be looking at and servicing. These are the oil drain lines that come from the airbox. And on the Africa Twin, part of the emissions process, I guess, the crankcase ventilation gets cycled back into the airbox, and then the oil vapors, when they condense, they actually drain into here. So this rear one routinely fills up with oil, and that's normal on these. So I would say I try to drain this every 1,000 kilometers or so. So it's, again, good to do that as part of the fall service. It's easy to do. You just kind of squeeze that clamp, move it up, pull that drain plug out. The one at the front here, it doesn't seem to get filled up at all, but the back one always does. And so that's something that you have to do. And on a bike with a shaft drive, like the M109R, obviously there's no chain to service, but it's important to change that gear oil according to the manufacturer's instructions. Some of them say, do it every 10 or 20,000 kilometers, but to be honest, I just do it. The stuff's not expensive. It only takes like 200 or 220 milliliters of gear oil, and it just costs you a couple of cents for the drain gasket that goes on the bottom. So why not keep it changed? So anytime I do an oil change, I also change the gear oil in that shaft drive as well.